Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Berzudi, and this is wait, let me check. This is the sixth episode of season 2 of the Youth for Discourse podcast, and we are starting right now with the discussion about cultural relativism. Now, I have here one of my good friends. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, geez, I did not think this far ahead. I'm Peter. Um, what should I tell them? What should I tell them? What should I tell the audience?
I don't know, just anything. Okay, it doesn't
Well, I
matter.
love playing the piano. That's a fun fact. I'm in the second year of a psychology major at U of C as well.
Okay, pretty epic. Yeah, so I'm thinking that first before we get into more of a broader discussion about cultural relativism. I think we should first talk about kind of defining it. Do you have a general definition of cultural
I do
relativism
not,
you
and
want
this is
to
something I've heard
throw
people
out
argue
there?
about a lot. So, yeah, coming up with a working definition is going to be huge for this topic.
I could throw one
Okay.
out there if you want.
Okay.
So I how about the definition that cultural relativism is the position that um you can't judge a culture according to an external set of values. You have to judge a culture according to its internal set of values.
Okay. So basically, what we're saying, relativism basically says that moral judgments are a product of culture, and thus you can only judge a culture morally by the values that are a result of it. Is that kind of what we're going with?
There's sure, yeah.
Okay.
I'll talk a bit about why about other aspects. I think we'll probably get into
Okay.
that, but yeah, let's just go
Okay.
with
So
that.
starting there. There's a lot to unpack there. I've never actually bothered to come up with a proper stance on this. I take actual stances on 3 or 4 issues tops. So a lot of this is just going to be me kind of chasing around various ideas. I mean, particularly in Canada, this is going to be a tough issue. As soon as you stick a whole bunch of different cultural groups next to each other, you've got values and moral frameworks that start coming into conflict, right? Like you can't not fundamentally. It makes it almost impossible to even ask a good question about this, because if you're trying to think about this framework, is it even right to assume that societal stability is actually a worthy goal? And I think most people would argue that it is, but we can't assume that. And then the question becomes, how do we actually go about producing that? And the answers to that are half cultural. So every culture is going to produce a different set of kind of, I guess, knee-jerk responses. So hang on, someone is arriving at my house. I shall return momentarily.
Okay. um yeah, very very interesting thoughts. I'm all alone right now. I don't know what exactly to say. Um yeah, something discussing the nature of different cultures, something. Yeah, I think that there's a challenge definitely in terms of discussing uh cultural tolerance, just because you get into the paradox of tolerance when it comes to cultures and pretty much everything, all of that. So I think at that point, cultural relativism kind of oh
Well, I think fundamentally what happens is that cultural relativism breaks down as soon as you try and find answers to issues that involve or transcend multiple cultural groups. If you're trying to solve a question of religious conflict between two religious groups, you can't solve it necessarily with if the religious frameworks are creating conflict between the two groups, it might not be possible to solve the issue from within the context of those two religions. So, if you're coming up with some kind of solution to that problem, and of course, you have to assume that a solution is actually what you want, but how do I don't know enough about cultural relativism as a philosophy to know this. I don't see an easy way to resolve it within that framework, because if you're trying to solve that kind of cross-cultural issue, you would need a philosophical or ethical or whatever framework that can incorporate and arguably transcend both original cultural groups that are having the dispute. So it's an interesting idea, but I don't see an easy way through it from that framework. I don't know if you've got some ideas on that.
I'm gonna try at the start to like avoid talking about my own opinion about this and just more like ask questions, just kind of like get an idea of like what you think about this issue.
That's
What are
valid.
your thoughts? Yeah, I want to try and be like as neutral of moderate as possible when it comes to this issue. So, and when it comes to these
Respectable.
issues in general.
Yeah, and technically I should be too.
Well, you're my guest, so
That's fair. That's fair.
uh,
So there's real
uh,
raw Peter moments today.
yeah, real raw. What are your thoughts? So I know you discussed that when it comes to negotiating disputes or I guess contradictions in values, you can even more broadly say between different cultures that you need there is some necessity to have some external or transcendent, as you said, value structure in order to mediate those kinds of like contradictions or disputes. What are your thoughts on? Do you think that if it is, how do I say this? Let's suppose that we're talking within a specific cultural group which only has um, effects. It's an isolated cultural group. So we're essentially has no effects on other cultures. So you don't have that issue of like clashes of values. Do you think that cultural relativism could be useful there? Like the view that okay, they're not actually coming to conflict with other cultural values external to it. So in that case, you don't run into those issues with regards to multiculturalism or cultural conflicts, and therefore maybe there is some use for cultural relativism there. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. I think I've understood your question. I think to answer it, we have to talk a little bit of philosophy first. Um,
Sure.
for mediating a dispute between two cultural groups, it's a good so fundamentally in communication, it is a fantastic ability to be able to understand another person's perspective, right? Like it's huge. It's the core of modern day like sales and negotiation practices. It's absolutely huge for like communication within relationships and families. Like basically, you could call it empathy, but it's slightly different than that. But fundamentally, the ability to understand um, the model of the world that the other person is operating in will tremendously improve your communication with that individual. Now, if a group's coming into conflict and we assume that resolving that conflict and bringing it towards some kind of peaceful equilibrium is beneficial, then getting both sides to figure out what the model of the world that the other side is operating under will help. Because usually what happens, like say in a cultural clash, right? You've got two different groups that have two possibly very different like moral structures and value hierarchies. They see the actions of the other group and they think, according to my moral standards, those are bad and wrong, right? And maybe they're right. Maybe according to their moral structure, what the other group is doing is bad and wrong, right? Now, the question becomes, what do you do about it? And understanding the model that other people are working under, their kind of moral assumptions and framework, and the end goals of the various actions that they're undertaking is huge. and can't be understood. And as far as I can tell, as soon as you understand that stuff, a lot of the conflict tends to disappear. Um, like I don't want to get too spicy with my examples.
I don't think it matters too much, but
How spicy can I go?
you can probably go spicy if you want. Like, I don't think it'll really.
Okay. Well, let me think. Okay. Well, here's a really simple example that people will just be familiar with. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a physics lecture, and I was waiting in line to ask the professor a question at the end of the class, and there was this girl there who was like dressed in very traditional Muslim wear and looked Muslim. And we were kind of talking, and she introduced herself, and I introduced myself, and I went to shake her hand. And she kind of said, "No, sorry, I can't do that." And it took me a minute. I had to think about it, and I went, "Oh, she's probably not allowed to have physical contact with men. That she's like, they're outside of her family or not married to her or whatever." And so I just switched quickly. I just bowed, and I said, "Very pleased to meet you." And she bowed back, and it was a great interaction, right? So, to some people, her not wanting to shake my hand might have been considered rude, right? By Western standards, arguably it is. By Muslim standards, it might have been quite rude for me to offer my hand to shake in the first place, right? But what we did was we took a bit of a step back from our assumptions, and we looked at what the other person was doing and why they were doing it, right? My goal was to kind of establish, friendly contact, and her goal was to basically be a good person. We're both trying to be good people according to our cultural values. And when we recognized that, we found a compromise that allowed both of us to meet our goals very nicely, right? That agreed with both of our frameworks. So very frequently, it's possible to resolve those issues completely by just understanding where the other person's coming from. I think that to me seems like a really good example of what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, that the example kind of resonates with me because, yeah, I had an identical thing happen to me like 2 months ago with a Muslim girl. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah, she, and once again, okay, she was very polite about it. Said, "No, sorry, I can't do it. It's a cultural thing. It's not you. It's cultural thing." Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, we had a very polite interaction. So,
Yeah.
and yeah, um, so do you think there's any role to be able to criticize other cultures from a moral perspective?
I think that's a good question. Um, Basically, I have never come up with a proper definition of culture. I don't know what the commonly accepted one is. Like these are things I just don't know off the top of my head. I've never clarified my thinking in that regard. So, just a disclaimer for the audience: this isn't something I'm totally comfortable speaking about. Um, I think it's possible to look at actions in context of what they do for life overall. And when I say life, I mean human life, I mean plant life, I mean animal life, just life in general. Like, because fundamentally, life creates meaning, and meaning creates morality, basically. Um, and like, let's take a simple example. I don't, for the audience who've seen photos of the planet Mars, right? It's this like rugged, inhospitable landscape full of mountains and dry canyons and everything. And to the outside observer, it looks, well, to me anyways, it looks quite beautiful, right? I'm not really sure why it looks beautiful. And it certainly wouldn't be very beautiful if I was there without a spacesuit, because I would die instantly, right? There is that. Like, Mars cannot support life. Regardless of that, somehow it's beautiful. We look at a nebula and we see something beautiful, right? Which is kind of weird, and I've never figured out why that is, but it's cool. Now, we don't probably want to undertake a whole bunch of actions that are going to turn our planet into Mars, because that would mean we would die. or have to adapt really quickly, but most life couldn't adapt to that and would very quickly die out. And put in those terms, most people would agree that actions leading to that kind of thing are bad, right? So, I think that if we're looking at the needs and the goals of life in a broader context, you can start to look at cultural practices and stuff and decide whether or not they support the flourishing of life. And if they do, you can pursue those. And if they don't, you can avoid them. That, I think, universalizes, but it takes a tremendous amount of work to do it. And just about every case operates differently. But I think it can be argued.
Okay. Yeah,
And
interesting.
and I recognize that it's really, really abstract. I'm trying to think of some good examples I could give.
Sure. I mean, we are dealing like cultural relativism itself is a very abstract topic, so it makes
Yeah,
sense why it necessitates us to go abstract. But feel free if you have any
yeah.
examples, go ahead.
Well, okay. Okay, we're gonna move up the Scoville heat scale with this example.
Go ahead.
So the Judeo-Christian tradition emphasizes the reservation of sex for marriage, right? That's a pretty old thing that dates back to like the early Jewish writings and proceeds into Christianity and proceeds arguably even more intensely into Islam. And that's been actually pretty deeply entrenched in Western culture in some really interesting ways. We've reached a time in history where that then there was a time where having a taboo on premarital sex was actually useful for societal stability and cohesion, which is, I think, part of why it developed in the first place. We've reached a point where that isn't necessarily the case, and it certainly isn't as obvious. Like the effects are much less immediate. For example, birth control means that you can have a lot of sex without having a lot of kids. So, the consequences of premarital sex change quite a bit. Now, there's other factors at play there, but I don't really want to get into it because they're not hugely relevant to the conversation. The point I want to make is that for a whole bunch of reasons, the Western world had basically a taboo on premarital sex, and therefore it had a taboo on basically the more free you were with your sexual expression, the more under taboo you were. I think that's fair to say so far, yeah?
Yeah.
And not every culture or religion has that, and certainly not to the same degree or in the same ways. Although in most agricultural societies, marriage is actually it's a common sociological institution that developed more or less independently across the world, which I think is really interesting. But where was I going with this? Right. So among other things with that taboo has come a taboo on public nudity, right? Indecent exposure, as it's been called in a lot of legal things. And that has remained, well, that's actually starting to collapse right about now. I was just thinking of some of the people I saw on the train a few weeks ago, but
Oh,
but Calgary Transit moment. But like hand in hand with a prohibition on premarital sex was an avoidance of things that would make it more likely, nudity being one of those things, right? And that had whatever effect it has, and that's starting to change now, and that's an interesting development for sure. So when social media was becoming a thing, there was a whole legal kerfuffle about what actually constituted pornography, actually, interestingly enough. And Facebook went through a whole bunch of different trials of basically what constitutes pornography. And originally it was any exposure of like the genital areas. And they extended that to include female breasts. And then a whole community of mothers who wanted to talk about breastfeeding for completely non-pornographic reasons got upset because they couldn't like post pictures of things that were relevant to the conversation. And so there was a whole bunch of public backlash about that. So Facebook changed the rules so that breasts could be posted on the site. And then people started posting a whole bunch of pornography with breasts in it. And Facebook was like, damn it. And so they changed it so that I think the nipples had to be covered, which they figured would satisfy breastfeeding mothers and also limit the amount of pornography that was actually visible. Right? So that whole thing was going on. And then something really interesting happened, which ties beautifully into the whole cultural relativism context, because there was this Facebook group dedicated to I forget exactly what it was. I don't know if it was a single tribe, but it was a cultural group in like Saharan Africa that herded goats. And sometimes they would have to like cross large expanses of desert where there wasn't very much water available. And they would take their goat herds with them, right? And sometimes on that trip, a mother goat that had like a young kid would, die or run off, or the milk would dry up. And so when that happened, if there was a kid that needed feeding, the human mothers that had kids and were breastfeeding would actually breastfeed the goats as they traveled, the little baby goats, right? So that the goats wouldn't die. So someone posted a picture of that on Facebook and it got banned. And then there was a whole bunch of public outcry about it, right? So, it's a fascinating conversation, but here's an example of something like it's a cultural practice that's undertaken to protect the lives of, animals, like herd animals, and the humans that are hurting them. And it's interesting sociologically. I think it's actually really cool. And it has to do with completely normal biological functions in a non-pornographic context. And Western culture has a really hard time dealing with that. Because, on the one hand, a whole bunch of people got upset that it got banned. A whole bunch of other people got upset because they thought it was bestiality, right? So that's one of those areas where Western culture, as it's been preserved for the last, several thousand years, has a really, really hard time dealing with that kind of issue. But if we apply that kind of rule of thumb I was talking about a minute ago, right? It's documenting activities that are entirely devoted to creating and promoting life, right? And I'd have to get into talking about needs, and that's a longer conversation. But basically, it's in a healthy context, as far as I can determine, if one actually understands what they're doing and isn't like seriously messed up oneself. I think it's very arguable that it's in a good context and it's interesting, and it just happens to follow a different set of cultural norms than the creators of Facebook. Right?
Yeah, interesting. That kind of reminds me. I don't remember the name of this, but I think there was like a Supreme Court case in the United States a while back, where essentially there was an argument about how do we define pornography itself, and
Oh yeah,
essentially they concluded, yeah, and the issue is that, like you said, the example of the African tribe, that's a completely non-pornographic thing, but under Facebook's definition of porn, it was, even though we wouldn't use it in that way. Um, Assuming
yeah,
that we understood the cultural context behind it, not assuming it
yeah,
was bestiality. Uh,
yeah,
and essentially, from what I remember, they came up with that they couldn't actually define what pornography was. They just simply
yeah,
decided to say that you know it when you
yeah,
see it,
yeah.
as opposed to,
I couldn't tell you what pornography is, but I'll know it when I see it.
yeah,
That was the ruling, and That's another interesting point. That would be an interesting podcast topic.
That would be
What is pornography and what should we do about it?
that would be an interesting podcast. Yeah.
Wouldn't it? I'd get banned so hard.
We would all get banned, I think.
Oh yeah.
I am slightly concerned because I think there would be a bit too much coomerism on the podcast, but
Probably.
that would be an interesting topic if we had a decent group of people who we all knew beforehand. Of course, I would
if we
be
had
a
a group
bit
of
more
people that were
comfortable.
willing to take it seriously, I think would be fine.
Yeah. Okay, but the problem is I'm not sure if I would take it seriously because I like to meme a lot as well. But
That's well, and honestly, with any tough subject, humor is actually a really good way to approach it. Humor, I've been trying to figure out how to define humor for 3 weeks now. Haven't come up with anything, but as far as I can tell, it's part of it is that it helps us cope with things that are terrible and horrifying, and it's like, this is why soldiers joke around so much, because it makes things that are just actually horrifying bearable, and it brings them down into the realm of things that can be dealt with and processed and related to without destroying yourself. I think that's one part of what it is, but I haven't figured out the rest of it. It would take so much effort for me to actually work that out, and I just don't feel like it.
It's kind of getting off topic though. But
yeah.
So as I understand, so if I can kind of summarize your perspective as I understand it so far, it's that cultural relativism allows us to better understand certain people's practices, because when you take a look at them from their own context, you're better able to empathize and understand things from their perspective when examining them. And therefore, there's a benefit to cultural relativism in that. At the same time, though, when it comes to the reality that we do live in a multicultural society, especially as Canada, and that we do have certain moral values, we have to ensure at the same time that that our own broader societal values adhere to broad human flourishing, and that we should be free to criticize cultures and cultural practices which don't contribute to that in some way. Is that kind of a good summary?
Sorry, could you repeat that last part? I dropped something extremely loud.
Oh, essentially, we should be that because we live in a multicultural society, we have to recognize that there should be more broad overarching values beyond simply just the cultural peculiarities of each culture in the society, and that we should be free to criticize cultures if they don't contribute to human flourishing.
Well, and not just human flourishing. I want to try and rephrase a little bit what I was getting at. But most of that is right on the ball. With cultural relativism, it's, I think, okay, so fundamentally, I think what cultural relativism says is you cannot construct a logical argument based on your cultural values to critique another culture's cultural values, because it breaks down on the assumption that your morals are more valid than their morals. I think that's a fair definition of cultural relativism. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't critique another culture, because assuming that culture is the totality of someone's identity or thinking is insane. You can, this will make people angry, but you can break people down in basically identity boxes, right down to the level of the individual. And I could prove that with math, actually, if I wanted to. I worked out a really nice way. Do you remember? You did calculus, right?
Yeah, I did.
Do you remember the Riemann sums, where you draw the rectangles?
Yeah, I do.
Under the curves. Yeah, and the more rectangles you have, the better approximation you get. And an integral is just the sum of infinite rectangles, basically. right?
Yeah, is that integral the individual?
Yeah, basically. I think I have a theory that individuals have a fundamentally integral nature, that in that context, basically meaning that you can break them down into infinite numbers of rectangles, that describe them and their personality and who they are. And I've heard people make quantum mechanical arguments that doesn't actually allow you to predict someone either, because there's a certain element of quantum uncertainty to the whole thing. I don't know. In any case, we don't even understand how the brain works. There's no way we can understand the individual based on like the overlap of culture and gender and race. Like, I'm sorry, it's just not possible. So that said, if you choose your rectangles correctly, you can actually get a very good estimation of the individual over a number of domains. But it should never be assumed that the most important things about people are the boxes in which you can fit them, because as soon as you do that, you open the gate to things like genocide, and it's just really bad. You can discriminate against an entire group of individuals based on a box that you fit them into, and that's a bad idea. Communication, I think, should always start on the level of the individual, and the individual can enact certain patterns of ideas or beliefs or morals or rituals or whatever practices. Based on like they can enact patterns, but the individual fundamentally is much more than a sum of patterns, and that should never be forgotten. So I want to clarify slightly what I mean, because it's that okay. So that's kind of that. And then as far as it's not, because it's not entirely about the flourishing of life, and that's going to sound weird. When I said that, I accidentally put like 2 years and several people's worth of philosophical work into that, which I forget that most people like don't share that framework with me. So I'd like to kind of elaborate on that if I could.
Sure.
Basically, so the Mongols under Genghis Khan went on a tear, and it's estimated they killed something like a quarter of the world's human population, right? And a significant portion of domestic pets along with them. So, the Mongols probably thought they were morally justified in whatever they were doing, right? And it's hard to say whether they would have felt morally justified it if a different cultural group came through and wiped them out in the same fashion. So culture doesn't necessarily explain the nuance of human activity, and it doesn't universalize to some of those issues. Like we can't say that oh, these two groups fight wars constantly and they genocide each other every 100 years, but it's their culture. How can we critique it? It's like they're killing each other a lot and causing a tremendous amount of pain and suffering, and that is not probably a good thing. And it's probably not even like very few culture, like a culture would have to basically be masochistic to accept pain and suffering. Well, I shouldn't even say that. That's like half of Western society. It's a tough argument, but basically, you can argue that some cultures have practices that are actually destructive on a large scale, and that are actually destructive by their own cultural values too, not just whatever Western Judeo-Christian ones I happen to be using right now. Like, it's quite possible that within their framework, Genghis Khan's horde was aware that they were being destructive and causing tremendous amounts of pain and suffering, and that was not something they'd want people to do to them. So if you look at it in the moral context, there's that. Now, some cultures end up with an assumption that other groups are like subhuman, and that gives them a right to, say, kill or enslave them. I've been reading about slavery the last little while. It's actually insane how widespread it was prior to, like, well, basically throughout most of human history, almost every culture has practiced slavery to a significant degree. The numbers are ridiculous, and there are some absolute atrocities that got perpetrated during that time. And the thing is, you'd have a culture that would keep slaves, and then some of its people would get enslaved, and they thought it was a bad thing when they got enslaved, but they were okay enslaving other people. So, we have this assumption that all humans are more or less intrinsically equal in value, which is very much a product of Judeo-Christian values. And you get similar things in Buddhism at the higher levels. And any high-level religion basically has that. But the assumption that humans are intrinsically equal in value is not a universal thing, nor is it a necessarily self-evident thing. But I can tell you that when large groups of people act under that assumption, life gets better for everyone. And to me, that seems like a good value to adopt culturally. If you find something that actually makes life better for everyone consistently over a long period of time, and whatever you can argue that who are you to say what makes life better or worse? Like, avoiding genocides, that's a good start. Like, I don't think many people would argue with that. So, if basically if you get culture practices that improve people's lives without like dramatically harming a whole bunch of other people consistently over a long period of time, that's a good place to start for picking cultural values. And most cultures have stuff towards that end. A lot of times cultures will put those things in only for their group. It's a new invention that we've come up with, cultural beliefs and practices that try and extend that to all humans, and more recently all life forms, which is very interesting development. But like fundamentally, that I think is kind of the logical, and that's as far as I can get right now, basically. If you're looking at things to adopt for culture to try and improve quality of life for all life over an extended period of time, that's the goal that you aim at, and whatever you adopt on the way there is a good step forwards.
Okay.
That was a hell of a monologue, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, I'm here for it. Okay, like the whole point is to let other people speak about like what their thoughts are on all this.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I know you're an exec, but still, like, yeah, generally speaking, my role is just to listen to people, kind of like unpack what they're saying, ask questions, all of that. Usually, unless kind of dies down, then I might add my own opinion in there for fun or something. Yeah.
Valid.
There's one other thing I was wanting to ask about. So I know at the very beginning, and I think I kind of like I kind of implied that I was going to do this. I know that at the very beginning, when we were discussing our definition of cultural relativism,
Yeah.
we mostly focusing on like cultural relativism as a moral position that essentially it is the belief that you can't judge morally a culture from the values external to it. That's morally wrong to judge other cultures because of their
Well,
practices.
it's not necessarily morally wrong, because whose morals are we going by here? But it is logically inconsistent. I think that's fair to say.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Now that kind of gets into funny contradiction stuff, but let's just ignore that. There's another aspect of it which I've read about, which I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on, which is not necessarily cultural relativism as a position on morality, but rather
Okay.
cultural relativism as a research methodology. The idea that
Okay.
when you're trying to examine a different culture, and you kind of like touched upon this vaguely, I think, um, throughout a lot of the things that you're saying, that when you're examining another culture, it's best to come at your study of that culture from the perspective of their own culture rather than from the perspective of whatever culture you were raised in. Do you think there's any merits to that idea as like a research methodology that you can still judge in theory another culture, but when you're trying to study and go in it, you should like try and study it from the perspective of that own culture?
Um, well, I think it's certainly worthwhile to try and understand that cultural perspective. Um, and to understand the cultural perspective, you have to know it really, really thoroughly. Whether or not you can ever, whether or not looking at a culture within the framework of that culture, like, it's useful, but I'd say it's more like understand the cultural framework, however you can best go about that, because then the culture and the actions of the people within the culture make a lot more sense, and you can explain it to other people and document it more precisely. Now, trying to study and explain a culture from the cultural perspective, it can run into issues. If you carry that too far, for example, you go to a culture that hasn't developed the process of logic yet, and you try and analyze that culture without using logic, and say you lose cause and effect, right? When you give up logic, it's it is possible, but basically all you're going to end up doing is re-articulating their worldview, which can be beneficial, but doesn't necessarily help in the study of that culture or the explanation of it to others. Fundamentally, what you have to do is you go in, understand their framework and how they see the world, and try and incorporate that into a larger model um, that that encompasses that culture and transcends it in the sense that you can bring it back and communicate it to others. Because that's basically the point of studying things is to produce information that you can share with other people, and when people act on it in a certain way, it produces consistent results. So I think really I'm just being picky about the definitions, but TLDR, yes. Um, it's very hard to understand a culture if you're stuck in your own culture. I think that's fair to say.
Okay. Um, I think that was about everything that I think we can discuss. Unless I give like my take on everything,
Oh,
but
I would love to hear your take. Well, because there's no one else here. We may as well hear it.
sure, whatever. Um, I think I would agree with a lot of the stuff that you said. That yeah, like uh, when it comes to cultures, there's obviously some elements that is subjective to cultures, and you have to like kind of take it within their own context. You gave the example, yes, of how that I really liked the Saharan goat example
Goat
of
breastfeeding.
how that
Yeah,
yeah
yeah.
goat
It's it's
breastfeeding,
it's
how that
one of my favorite cultural examples that I know well. It's versatile and it makes the point really well, and it's kind of humorous and also really important.
yeah, that essentially without understanding what was happening from their own culture perspective, it can lead you to risking essentially judging that culture in a wrong way for some that was in reality pretty innocuous.
Yeah.
Um, and at the same time, though, I do think that yes, when it comes to certain elements of culture and all of that, it's fine and if not almost required to criticize elements of a culture when they don't support. Um, I know you didn't necessarily like me saying human flourishing. Like what
Well,
was
I
it?
actually I like it and I agree with it. I just understand that the listeners aren't going to have any idea what the hell we're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say human flourishing.
Yeah,
I remember I you had like a set of criteria, and I don't remember off the top of my head right now. So let's say human flourishing just for simplicity's sake. But
for
yeah,
sure.
you should be free to criticize cultures which um do not contribute to human flourishing and don't even contribute to their own flourishing, especially. Um, in fact, I almost see the argument about cultural relativism to be essentially the same as the argument of moral relativism. I mean, whenever you're whenever you're trying to advocate for changing something, whenever you're trying to criticize, say I'm trying to criticize some policy that exists in my country, that exists in Canada, whenever
Yeah.
you're doing that, you're necessarily adopting a different perspective from the perspective on which that policy was implemented in. And therefore you're judging that policy from the perspective and from an external perspective. And so I almost see the argument of cultural relativism about whether or not you should be able to criticize other cultures as essentially analogous to the question of moral relativism, where I think that literally no one would ever advocate for in practice that
Yeah.
you can't criticize some action that your government takes, that you can't advocate for things to be different in some way. Um, and so I think that in the same way that you are free to do that with regards to individual people's actions, individual policies, I think you're free to do that when it comes to cultures. Um, I think that there's kind of nefarious motives sometimes when it comes to cultural relativism, because I think that people are kind of trying to sneak in the fact that I think that people are trying to like sneak past that by suggesting there's something fundamentally different about the unit of a culture as opposed to the unit of an individual's actions or an individual policy. Um, and I could get into that a bit more. But I think that in the same way that you're free to criticize ideas, free to criticize policies, you should absolutely be free to criticize cultures in those ways.
Yeah, you just have to,
So
like, fundamentally, you just have to be clear about what you're criticizing and how you're criticizing it. And,
exactly, yeah.
what's the integrity of your argument? What's the end result of your argument? And just to have a lot of clarity in what you're talking about. And then you can actually judge the argument on its own grounds.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing about, in fact, because this is my general understanding of cultural relativism before I started reading a bit more into it, was that it was more of a moral position. But what was actually fascinating was that if when I read it, well, I wouldn't say I've read it an extensive amount, but like I read an article about that. It was presented by a sociologist I found particularly interesting, um, where essentially they discussed how there's both the moral elements of it, but there's also more of the methodological element to it that which I discussed with you. And I think I agree that yeah, you need I think there is some value when it comes to understanding another culture and taking a culturally relativist standpoint to it. Now, is that the only standpoint that you should take to it? Probably not in most cases. Um, but I think that that's a valuable standpoint to take. That the idea of coming at it from a purely neutral perspective, as neutral as possible, from the perspective of their culture, taking everything and every value of the culture as given when you're examining that culture. I think this is a great level of importance that it advances understanding a lot of context. Obviously, not the only perspective you should take when trying to understand something, but definitely a perspective that's quite important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. Okay, just for my own curiosity, I just want to backtrack for a second. You're talking about kind of critiques of cultural and moral relativism. You're talking about something intrinsically different about the cultural unit as opposed to moral action. I didn't quite get what you were saying there. Would you mind just briefly elaborating on that?
Sure. How I think a lot of people who talk about cultural relativism, they treat cultures as different from like or ideas or like policies, in that people will be you're free to criticize like various ideas from a moral perspective, various policies from a moral perspective, but you're not free to criticize certain cultures from a moral perspective. They almost treat the unit of a culture as like a higher thing, which is immune to criticism almost, I find.
Okay, gotcha. Also, hello to whoever just joined the podcast.
Hello.
I
Hello,
heard it
hello.
ding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. I meant to do the podcast today way earlier. Then I was playing video games and I kind of forgot. So, rip. Like,
Understandable.
Yeah. Yeah, we're probably gonna wrap up pretty soon, but I don't know. Do you have any thoughts that you want to say with regards to cultural relativism?
um, honestly, I don't. I was intending on joining the podcast, but I don't necessarily feel that strong on the topic. I think my culture based, your culture cringe. I think that sums up my position pretty much.
Understandable.
Okay, yeah. Understandable, yeah. They're pretty
Yeah,
based.
it seems like one of those issues that a lot of people haven't ever really fully thought through. Like, it's most people I've talked to don't have a really like strong stance on it. Interestingly enough.
I think no.
Yeah.
I think what Jonathan was originally saying is 100% correct. people treat cultures like it's sacrosanct or something. Like you can't criticize it. Well, I think like personally, I think you should criticize any culture, and like I think there's a lot of cultures that you are allowed to criticize, but like there's some cultures that are like kind of off limits. Like for example, in the West, you can criticize Western culture or like white European culture a lot. While like more other cultures that you're not necessarily allowed to criticize are the ones from like the third or second world. I think I find that a lot when I have discussions with people, particularly people who are more left leaning. But I guess it's also my thought.
I have noticed that
No,
trend
here's
too.
something. Wait, could I? Here's
Yeah,
something
no, go for it.
particularly interesting, and that's what I was talking about the nefarious notion of what I think cultural relativism is, because it when you talk to a lot of people from academically leaning, they'll suggest that there is no such thing as white culture. So therefore, you criticizing what is essentially white culture, you can actually get away with that even under cultural relativism because you rejected the idea that that's a culture, and
I
therefore you
know.
can treat, and therefore you essentially put that idea at a disadvantage, that culture at a disadvantage when it comes to critique, because you can't critique that culture because you deny the fact that it's a culture, whereas all other cultures are held up as sacrosanct almost and immune from
Yeah,
critique.
It's
exactly.
interesting that you guys. It's interesting that you guys use the word sacrosanct. Would either of you kind of share what you mean by that?
Like it's like
I was
something
I was
holy.
using it because
Yeah,
you're saying it, but yeah.
yeah, no, it's like something holy. Like you can't criticize it. Like you know, how people like don't criticize a lot of religion. That's what I meant. They treat
Hmm.
culture like it is a religion. Like it's
I
something
see.
that's integral to.
So,
And culture is integral to people's lives, but it's like it's not
right.
something that drives every notion of someone's life. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So what makes something holy then?
What makes I don't think anyone. I don't think anything's holy except for my religion. That's I'm a bit biased there.
Yeah. Well, in that case, what makes your religion holy?
Because
If we're using it
God,
in the sacrosanct kind of
because
definition.
because it was sent by God Himself, and it's the Word of God. That's
Okay. So we're arguing that it's something almost entirely transcendent of humanity at this point,
yes, I guess
and that
I
it's
think
a
that
good that's been revealed to humanity that like has its source outside of the human understanding.
exactly.
Okay.
I
And it's
think though that
interesting
when
that you
we're
bring up culture in those terms.
Yeah,
I think when
because
we're talking about
oh, sorry, go ahead.
okay, I think when we're talking about culture as sacrosanct, we're kind of it's more metaphorical that we're treating culture as if it is sacrosanct
Yeah. Well, and
in
I
these
think you're right.
discourses.
But
Um,
I think it's actually uh, it is actually a really important point here. Um, because like fundamentally, I think the way it's being used in this conversation, if I'm not mistaken, is basically to suggest that something is above critique. When is something above critique?
yeah,
Well, when it aligns with our morality. When does and then as soon as when we raise the question of morality, that's a large part of what culture encompasses. It's basically the morality of a large group of people and their traditions that surround it, which interestingly gets tied up with religion a
I
lot.
disagree. I disagree.
You,
I
how would you
don't
do?
think I don't think culture determines morality. I think culture when I define as culture, I think culture is like things like events you go to, like food you eat, the language you speak, how you interact with other people. I think what drives morality is religion exclusively, or lack of the religion therefore.
Hmm. Okay, I want to think about this.
you think
Um,
that cultural, like for instance, when we're talking about certain cultural gatherings or whatever, I think that those are derived often from some set of values. Like say that you're doing some ritual or whatever for some purpose of, I don't know, appeasing some god. Let's talk about some tribal culture. Like that comes from a set of
That's
values
religion.
according
That's in itself
concerning.
religion. That's religion.
But it's like the religion and culture like kind of mend themselves together. So I think that culture kind of does encompass values to some
well,
extent.
here's a question, right? Let's say we've got um, so this is I mean we could quibble about the definition of religion too. As
Yeah,
far as I can tell, religion
that's a good
is
conversation.
it's as far as I can tell, it's basically the overlap of culture and spirituality.
Yes,
Um,
that's how I would define it.
yeah, and then you get things like animistic religions, which like predate, say the Greek pantheons, like where for example the world itself has um,
Spiritual way.
basically like what's the word um, personified life in all things. How's that?
Yeah,
So
I think
the sky has life, and the rocks and the streams have life and stuff, and everything has spirit. That's what we're going for here.
yeah.
So whether or not you want to define that as a religion is one thing, but there's also values. Let's say in our very modern terms, let's say cultural stability, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is common to most cultural groups. I think it's actually a prerequisite of cultural groups, and I think culture largely exists to promote um, basically societal stability. That's I'm not solid on that argument. I've never actually thought it all the way through, but this is just an idea that I'm exploring here. So let's say that societal stability is kind of we could say societal stability in family groups if we're talking about like really really old times. We could talk about societal stability in terms of a village. We could talk about it in terms of like a more of a contemporary nation or a kingdom or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's basically the proclivity of humans to live in proximity of each other and work towards shared goals without murdering each other or all the time. Like that's basically it's the ability of humans to cooperate in large groups, and that has proven beneficial to the species at large, or to the group that you're cooperating with, anyways. Like when large groups of people cooperate well, everyone in those groups benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So
So you're saying like culture is
that
the
is
thing
not
that
necessarily
like that brings everything together. It's like the glue.
kind of. It's the components of a shared worldview that help unite people in goals and projects, and allows them to cooperate and work towards higher ends. Now, a lot of the time, a religion is basically culture that is working towards a divine ideal, which is the word. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's the word of God. But it's some kind of ideal, highest good that actually transcends humanity and exists independently of it. And the idea is that if you practice your religion properly, you will move towards this higher good, and that benefits you and everyone else here and in all of the various forms of afterlife. And so, religion absolutely plays into that, but I think it's also entirely possible to have culture without religion and without atheism, which is the active antagonistic approach to religion. Atheism can't exist without religion by
Yeah,
definition.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's some elements of culture that are separate from religion. They overlap a lot. But for example, the desire for societal stability, my hypothesis is that predates formal organized religion, because I think that exists in family groups, and there's a whole bunch of
I
other animals that evidence like family groups and stuff.
I
So
I fundamentally disagree with you on that. I think that as
also,
long as there have been humans, there has been some sort of religion, whether that be mostly polytheistic, some monotheistic. I think as long as there were humans, there's been a religion, and I think culture is just an offshoot of religion in itself. You can like argue that.
okay, so you would define things like animistic philosophies as religion then,
Yes, yes, because
and that
they're fundamentally because religion is like I would define religion as a sense of like trying to make like a theory of everything for like the meaning of life, the theory of everything's for the universe, like the worldview, spirituality, all that bundled in one thing. And animistic like cultures, I think they can be defined as religion effectively because
would
they
you
do.
would you define science as a religion?
New way. Science is just so, it depends actually. Science in the more modern sense is in the more postmodern sense, I guess, is like trying to like become a separate religion in itself by trying to like separate itself. They how do I explain this? Like um, one second. How do I explain this? I feel
Basically,
like
that the pursuit of science is the highest good that humans can aspire
yeah,
to. How's
yeah,
that?
yeah, exactly. That's what I was trying to say.
Okay. And
Well,
so as soon as you put the highest good at the top of the pursuit of science, then it becomes a religion. Is that what you'd say?
yes, and while science at the same time could simply just be like a process in which to understand the material world. It could be both of
Yeah.
those.
Yeah. Okay. I think, yeah. I mean, well, by the technical definition, science is a tool. And any tool that purports that it encompasses the highest good, or anytime people purport that a tool encompasses the highest good, I think people have gone very off track, because a tool can only provide you ways of looking for the highest good. It can't. Science science can explain why we pursue the highest good. It's actually getting to the point where it can do that, and it can provide some clues of what it is, but it cannot justify the pursuit itself. It can't justify it. How's that?
That's
It
interesting.
can explain it. It can explain it, but it can't justify it.
Like for
And
example,
it's a
I'd
subtle,
put
but it's an important distinction.
like for example, I would put like communism in the same branch as like religion. I think I'm not like a I'm
Yeah,
not like a Ben Shapiro type, but I still think like the way people interpret communism, use communism, they almost treat it like post-Marxism. They almost treat it like as a religion, because
yeah,
it gives them like a theory of everything. It gives them like a sense of purpose, like the global revolution. You know what I mean?
yeah. It's the idea that everything that they experience can be contained and looked at through the framework of religion.
Yeah.
That's well said. I think that's actually quite a good argument.
Um.
So,
Go ahead.
so I just want to figure out how to phrase this. So, as far as I understand you, then you've argued that as long as there have been humans, there's been religion, and religion. Give me a working definition of religion here,
Okay. Religion
just to
is
double check.
Basically it's just a set of beliefs that give you a theory of everything on the universe. Like for example, Islam and Christianity and Judaism say that the universe and all its laws were created by an omniscient, all omnipresent being. It gives you a sense of it gives you a sense of like divine purpose. Um, like what else would that be? It would also give you like a way to like some sort of like divine achievement. It dictates your day-to-day life, and it dictates like your purpose. That I think those are like some requirements for something to be considered a religion.
I missed the first half of it. I got a very inconvenient timed phone call. Sorry, would you mind reiterating?
Yeah, yeah. So religion, it gives you a theory of everything. Like for example, in the Abrahamic religions, it gives you like God created the universe, and that's the theory of everything. An omnipresent being created everything, and then it gives you like a divine purpose. It gives you like your day to day life, how you should live your day to day life. It does a lot. I think those are the things that mainly I would classify as religion. That would be
Okay.
yeah.
Now you've included in this the definition of an omnipresent, omnipotent being that created everything.
I'm
Is
no,
that
no, no,
essential
no,
to your definition of religion?
no. I just I use it as an example. Like I'm saying that Abrahamic religions believe as a theory of everything that an omnipresent, I can't say the word, like a
Omniscient. It's a tough
omniscient,
one.
yeah, omniscient being created the world, and that's the theory of everything. In itself, what I'm saying, a theory of everything is a class, is like one of
Okay.
the things that makes a religion a religion.
All right. And you would say that it orients you in basically all of your
All aspects
like
of life.
activities.
Yeah, all
Yeah.
aspects.
So okay. Now, and you would argue that culture doesn't do that.
Culture does not do that, no.
Okay. Now, you said that culture is an offshoot of religion.
Yes, because culture is derived from religion. All cultures are derived from religion.
All
Like,
cultures are divided. Hmm.
or like a combination of religions. So, for example, I'll give you an example. A modern European culture, at least like before the modern age, was an offshoot of pagan religion and Christianity. Like they combined to make Western cultural practices. Like Christmas is in itself a combination of pagan festivals and like the celebration of Christ's birth. I think. I'm not Christian. Sorry, sorry, but
Christmas? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
celebration
the
of
birth
Christ's
of
birth.
Christ is the big one.
Yeah. So those two things are Christmas in itself is a cultural and a religious thing. But over time, as people got less religious, it became a cultural thing. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Okay, so basically when a religion loses the aspect of divinity, it becomes a culture.
Yes, exactly. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay. So culture plus spirituality equals religion.
I guess you could say that. Yeah.
Okay. Now, is it possible to have a group of humans that did not participate in the world spiritually?
No, I think everyone participates in the world spiritually one way or another.
Interesting.
And
I like
if
that.
someone claims they don't, they're probably lying or like being cringe. I don't know what to say.
Interesting. Thank you for
Because
elaborating on that. I appreciate it.
yeah, no, because even atheists, they treat, like I said, like think back to the science example, they treat science as a religion. Like I saw a Reddit post, which is some guy, I'm presumably a young guy. He put like a Bunsen burner instead of like the angel on the Christmas tree, which is in itself replacing another one religion with another one religious like figure with another religious figure. He co-opted the Bunsen burner as a religious figure in itself. You know what I mean? So atheists,
Yeah.
As an atheist, I would comment on this, but I fear that may stray too off topic.
yeah,
Honestly, I'm
I'm just
curious.
using it as a like an example, but you can elaborate if you want to.
Sure, I think that if you're to define religion as in some sort of like I don't know, like sense of thing that one orients themselves around, I think that a lot of atheists still do that to some extent. Whether you could argue that be their own personal pleasure, it could be some higher ideal. Um, that isn't necessarily a god. So I think you are somewhat correct in that atheists necessarily have to engage to some extent in sort of spiritual, some sort of spirituality, whether it be supernatural or not. I think there's some elements of truth to that, but
You
I
wouldn't
think
agree that every person does that?
um there might be some like incredibly nihilistic people who don't. Um,
Well, I think nihilism is silly. I've never actually met or heard of a real nihilist. Because if you reject meaning, okay, basically, you can't reject meaning because meaning is the
What keeps you going?
experience of the fundamental needs of life.
Yeah.
I think a
Um,
lot of people act nihilistically though, even if they don't necessarily won't necessarily like say.
I think a lot of people get confused. But fundamentally, to act in the world at all, you have to have some experience of meaning. Because otherwise, you would just lie around and drool.
Yeah, true.
Like, there's no way around that. So to act in the world at all requires some kind of value structure. It requires some experience of meaning, and it is literally impossible for a human to actually be nihilistic. Now, it's totally possible to believe in nihilism and to act in ways that are incredibly harmful to yourself and others under the name of nihilism. That is 100% possible. It's very possible to set up patterns of behavior that are very, very distant from your actual needs, that don't meet your needs effectively, and that sucks. And that's what a lot of people experience as a meaning crisis. Is basically that their actions they're taking are not producing an experience of meaning. So
Yeah, that's what I mean when I say that people are act nihilistic. Is that yeah, the actions they're doing they don't have some sense of meaning
yeah,
explicit with their actions.
yeah, basically they but to act requires meaning, and at the end of the day, you can't be a nihilist and be alive.
True. I was gonna
The
say that, but
logical the
I don't
logical
want to say.
endpoint of nihilism is not just death, it's non-existence.
I was gonna say that, but I don't want to sound too edgy. So thank you for saying it.
Honestly,
Uh,
I'm not even convinced it's edgy. I think it's maybe I'm just horribly biased, but to me it seems like quite a logical argument.
No.
yeah.
I was gonna say like something like nihilists don't live too long, but like, nah, I shouldn't say that on a podcast.
I mean, well, the stress that comes with patterns of behavior that are myth-aligned, that creates a lot of stress, and chronic stress has been proven to shorten people's lifespans. So I'm not even going to argue with you there. Like biologically on a large scale, you're right.
I just want to
You
like
know, were
shift
there
the
are there
focus of
examples to the contrary? Absolutely, but
yeah. I just want to shift the focus of the conversation a little bit since we're like kind of reaching the end of it. What do you guys think of like this notion? I've seen a lot online recently. This notion that you're like culturally committed suicide. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Your culture commits suicide?
No, Europe
Ooh.
culturally committed suicide after World War II.
Oh, you're talking about Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Um, so so Nietzsche was the guy who went on his whole thing about how God is dead, we've killed him, we'll never find enough water to wash away the blood. That whole thing. And as far as I can tell, I haven't cited a lot of Nietzsche. From what I can tell, his argument was basically that Western society was operating under Judeo-Christian morality,
Mm-hmm.
but they no longer worshipped God.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I think that's
I mean
exactly right.
that kind of in the abstract sense, that they no longer really participated in the spiritual aspect of their culture. So all of their cultural morals and values and norms, Nietzsche argued, had lost epistemological validity.
Right.
And by what I mean by that is that if you believe in God and you believe that the word of God explains how you should live, and then you live in that way, your argument has validity right down to the word of God. And that's the level that you have to discuss it on then. And that's fair. That's actually not a bad place to be. Like, frankly, if you follow the Bible and you live it, reasonably well, especially the Gospels, you're going to do okay. You're going to live a pretty good life. And, kudos to you. So Nietzsche's argument was that when people gave up their belief in God and gave up their participation in religion, they also gave up the right to hold the cultural norms and values that went with that religion.
Mm-hmm.
When you don't believe in the word of God, you can't value the things that you can't use God basically as the argument for
That's
which to value things.
justification.
So Nietzsche's point was not necessarily that religion was bad or that it had failed entirely. His point was that a lot of people didn't believe in God, but still followed the word of God, and that their worldview no longer had structure. And he was right, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's
And if
something that
I
we
could,
still haven't found our way through.
yeah. As someone I've read a bit of one of his works, Genealogy of Morals,
Yeah.
but I have a general, I'd say, cursory understanding for the most part, is that I find him really fascinating because he essentially asserts that yes, that we kind of have like the remnants of religion within society, even if we don't believe in God,
Yeah.
and that the fact that we no longer believe in God, the fact that we no longer have a reason for our own morality, it leads to things such as conflict and nihilism. A lot of the nihilism we see today when it comes to the fact that people don't have a sense of meaning in their lives. And his hope at the end of that, which is something I find especially fascinating, is that he believed that it was possible to adopt a sense of meaning without God, but that was something which would take hundreds of years for humanity to be able to confront that question of how do we find a sense of meaning without God?
It's a tough question.
Yeah, and
It's a very
it's
tough
not even a
question.
how. Because that presupposes that there is some possibility. It's the first question is if, then how.
Yeah. Well, I don't think Nietzsche ever made an argument for the existence of morality. I think he said, I believe in it, and I hope that sooner or later people figure it out. And Nietzsche went back and
Yeah.
forth, like, even in the course of his own books. He was Nietzsche was so smart and also damaged. So as he wrote, a whole bunch of stuff spilled out of him that he never bothered to integrate. And I think Carl Jung he studied Nietzsche. He studied a lot of Nietzsche. He also studied a lot of Freud, and took the best parts of all of their ideas and like unified it into a philosophy that actually works really well. But I can't really talk on that. I know less of Jung than I should. Um, but yeah, no, Nietzsche never finished his ideas. He never pulled them together, and he suggested a lot of different things within the same passages that were fundamentally in conflict with each other.
It's like he
And
was
he was
having a
he was a
conversation
really
with.
really bloody smart guy who also had syphilis and was going insane when he wrote half that stuff. So yeah,
Yeah. It was
there's
like he was
that.
having a conversation with himself within the pages of his own book, right?
I think that's
Yeah.
exactly what it was. That's well said.
And the whole point wasn't for him to necessarily argue what he believes. It was rather just get people to think about something.
Exactly.
Yeah. He. Well, there was that whole passage in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he went on his thing and he was like, he was like talking to the people, and he was like, I don't want disciples. Literally, if you're not arguing with me, I hate you. I'm over dramatizing it, but that was basically his point. His point was that he
Yeah.
wanted people who disagreed with him and who would argue with him and who would try and prove him wrong. And he was convinced he was right, but he wanted people who would try and prove him wrong nonetheless, which is a really, really interesting dichotomy, because fundamentally you kind of have to have that. Like you have to think you're right, and you have to also accept that you're not. But by thinking you're right, that gives you the, or thinking that you're at least halfway right, gives you the kind of impetus to put it out in the world, and then people can argue with you and you can make actual progress, right?
Yeah. Okay. We have gotten so off topic of culture. It's been
We
really
have.
interesting. I think we should probably end the podcast around here just
Yeah, I
so
think
that
that's
we
fair. I
don't
have to go eat dinner.
get on some. Yeah, fair enough. If
Been
you want, we
long
can talk
time.
for a few minutes after the podcast. But yeah, then
Yeah,
feel
100%. Oh,
yeah.
and Jonathan,
Okay.
I would love to pick your brain about a couple new, like, further podcast topics, or and even just things that I think would be interesting for us to discuss. If you've got a
Sure.
couple of
Let's
minutes.
talk. Yeah. Wait. Let me just. Okay. Then yeah, I guess we'll end this. To the viewers at home, thank you so much for watching. I hope you
Yeah,
enjoyed this interesting podcast as much as I did.
I hope
We
everyone
kind
loved
of
my
went.
hour-long monologue in the middle of it.
Yeah, we kind of went all over the place with various stuff. We talked about like culture relatives as a moral thing. We talked about it as a methodology. We talked about how do we define religion and culture and what the relationship is between each other. Something about Nietzsche, pretty cool. I think it's a
The
good
grind
summary of
set.
the
Yeah,
grind set.
yeah.
So
Well, thank you
yeah,
guys.
thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.